Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
And I am here again with Steph Young, and tonight we're going to be talking about her latest book, Panic in the Woods. That is your latest one, right?
There's one after it, actually, now.
There's one after it now?
Yeah.
Oh, my God, you write so fast. Okay, your second to latest book.
Yeah.
What is your latest book?
Stalked in the Woods.
Stalked in the Woods, okay. I think you sent me both of them, and I thought the Panic one was the most recent.
Yeah.
Well, you'll be back for Stalked in the Woods sometime soon. So this makes book 697 for you. And you're adding one more thing to your plate. You're going to be doing your own radio show.
I am, yes.
And what is the name you are currently going with?
I'm going to call it Welcome to the Dark Parade, because I have this image in my mind of a procession of this cast of characters. So you've got the black-eyed kids, you've got the demons, you've got the ghosts, you've got the Wendigo, you've got Bigfoot, you've got so many different entities, and I kind of see it like a carnival where they're all walking around, some kind of strange procession. And each week I'll probably say, so today we're going to look at the black-eyed kids and give some true stories. Then maybe next week we'll look at some really strange disappearances where the paranormal might have been involved, or they might have had sightings of some kind of entity. So each week we might sort of take a look at one of the characters in this macabre sort of parade.
And you're going to be doing this in story form. It's not going to be an interview show.
Yeah, most weeks is going to be stories, kind of like how I do with you, Soraya. So I'll talk about a particular case or a particular sighting. But maybe once a month, I might be doing a more in-depth look at a particular missing case or a really weird disappearance, so more of an investigation into those. So I might take a look back at Elisa Lam or one of the college boys that ended up drowning. So generally it's going to be really like I do with you, Soraya, where I just sort of describe a particular story, and that's probably it.
And this is actually going to be available not only through your own iTunes feed, but we are going to include it in the Where Did the Road Go feed as well.
Yes. And I'm very excited about that. And I have to say thank you so much, Soraya, because it's so kind of you to invite me in. And you've always been my biggest supporter and a real true friend. So I'm very honoured.
Well, I'm happy to have you as the first sort of sideshow for Where Did the Road Go. It's something I've wanted to do for a while now, and you're the first of two. The other one I haven't announced yet, so we'll be hopefully getting to that at some point soon. But this is going to start the last week of January.
Yes.
And the great thing about that is it's right after the 4th anniversary of Where Did the Road Go.
Oh, brilliant. Oh.
So people wanted more content. I think you doing a show is more content enough for anyone.
There will be lots. Yeah, lots of really strange stories.
All right. So let's get into Panic in the Woods. There'll be more about that. You have your own website coming. And
yes, own website. So it will go out on Deprogrammed Radio like your one does.
Yes.
And be up on YouTube, iTunes, all of those places.
And for anyone who's ecstatically happy about Steph doing the show, you have John Tudor of Deprogrammed Radio to thank for that.
Yes, we do. Yes. Thank you, John Tudor, for approaching me. Yes, very, very kind.
And he has helped this show out greatly as well. He's an awesome individual.
He is fantastic. He's been so helpful to me and so kind. Yeah, really, really, really honoured to be asked on there.
All right. So let's get into Panic in the Woods. And the first chapter really is just baffling to me. And you have it titled Assassination, Mutilations, Robberies, Ghosts, and a Baffling Disappearance. And it's really just one story. about
I
this
know.
about this guy researching Lincoln of all things.
Well, it is so baffling because I've never come across a story that encompasses so many different things as well. And it started out when a New York advertising man called Don Kemp, back in April 1984, he decided to take off and leave his job. Well, he had had a traffic accident, which meant that he was a little bit disabled from it, and people wondered if that contributed to him deciding to take time off, from the advertising world and go somewhere a bit more tranquil. And they believed that he'd probably taken off to write a book about Abraham Lincoln, and specifically about his assassination, because he belonged to a group of people that would meet all the time and conduct research into what they thought happened. So he set off one day on his own in the car, and he'd loaded all of his belongings into it, and he drove, and he was in Wyoming, a very barren part, when sometime later his car was found with the headlights on and the engine still running and the door open and items of his clothing trailing out of the door, but he was nowhere to be seen. So immediately the police came to the scene and started looking for him, and they found what they believed were tracks leading away from the car going off onto the prairie. And at this point, although it was freezing cold, it hadn't started to snow yet. The snow came a couple of days later. Well, they looked all around the car and they were baffled because the footsteps kind of stopped, and they extended the search and brought helicopters in, and 6 miles away in a barn they found one of his socks, and it was next to a pile of wood. So it was almost as though he'd somehow managed to get there and was going to start a fire. But of course they couldn't work out how he did get there because he didn't have any tracks leading to the barn. Well, he is gone, and they can't find him at all. So in the meanwhile, a friend of his who was an artist called Judy, who lived in New York, received 2 telephone messages, and she didn't get them for at least a month because she was out of town. And in those days, messages could be left on answer phones. So when she got back home, she listened to the messages and she was convinced it was him. But she did say that his voice sounded quite strained, as though he was a bit stressed. Well, the police traced where the phone calls had come from, and it turned out to have been from a trailer in Wyoming. And a young man lived there, and the police went to interview him. But he said, "I've got no idea what you're talking about. I haven't made any phone calls." Well, his number had come up as the one that had been used to phone the friend. So the police questioned him, and eventually the sheriff ruled him out and said, "No, I don't believe he's played any part at all." But nobody could really solve how his phone had been used. And even stranger was that Don Kemp's sister, years later, said about the case, well, it was so strange because she said, the boy in the trailer and my brother looked so alike that they actually could have been doppelgangers. And she said if you'd have looked at their high school pictures, you'd have said it was the same boy.
That's so bizarre.
Yeah.
On top of all the other bizarre things in this case.
Yeah, and the thing was, Don Kemp's mother was really convinced that this boy had to have played a part. And so she was quite insistent, and in the end, this man got a lawyer and then he moved away. But he didn't move away immediately. He didn't just take off. It was several months before he said, "Look, I've had enough of this. I've got to leave." So he left the picture. But there were other strange things as well, because during the time that he was missing, 2 people came forward to say that they'd had sightings of him and they'd seen him accompanied by other people, one of which I think was on New Year's Day. Well, I suppose you could say that sometimes if you know of somebody missing and their poster's been put up or it's in the newspapers, you're kind of alert to it. So if you see somebody who looks like them, maybe you think they are. So I don't know how accurate that was. But the case gets really, really strange because 4 years later, his body is found very close to the place where the car was found abandoned on the prairie. So his body turns up, and it turns out that, it appears that he died of exposure, but his body is pristine. So the weird thing is that it would have to have been lying out there for, well, I suppose 4 years, and yet there's no predation to the body. And anybody who lived locally said in the papers this is not possible because the animals, the predators, would have unfortunately got to his body. So they can't understand how nobody also would have come across this body for 4 years. Even if it was just the man who owned the land, surely would have seen it there. So his sister said that she was then contacted by a professor that worked at the Smithsonian Institute, who was a forensic anthropologist who was also a trainer and tutor at the FBI. And he said, I'm really interested in the case of your brother and I'd like to see his body. So the sister said okay, and the professor took possession of the body and carried out his own investigation. Well, he got back to the sister and he said, I don't know how to explain this to you, but the hyoid bone, which is a bone that connects the tongue to the back of the mouth, well, that was missing. And he said also that he had a really strange tiny round hole in the top of his head. And the professor said, I don't know of any man-made object that could make a hole like that. I've never seen anything like it. And his sister knew that this was Don's body because the injuries where he'd had the car accident were still there, any sort of scars. So it wasn't that this wasn't his body, but they couldn't explain how he'd got this hole in his head. And then his sister said, well, at the time that my brother disappeared, I was contacted by a group who were camping out in the area. And the head of this group was another professor. And he said, I've contacted you because we were in the area when your brother disappeared and we were studying cases of cattle mutilation. So we believe that this is what's happened to your brother and they've taken him. So he clearly meant aliens. Well, his sister said, I don't know about that because back in the 80s, there were no TV shows that really dealt with alien abductions and ghosts and all the paranormal stuff you can watch now. And I knew nothing about UFOs, aliens, anything like that. But she said, the weird thing was my brother, before he disappeared, he gave me a book, and the book was about the mysteries of the universe. And he turned to a page and he said, just keep this book, and this is the page that I think you might need at some point in the future. He said, I can't tell you why, I don't know why, but I just have a feeling. Well, the page was about the Pleiades. So again, she said, well, I didn't know anything about that, so I just put it on my bookshelf and left it. Well, she also said that she believed this was all her fault because before he disappeared, they went to a museum that held a lot of items for Abraham Lincoln in Maryland. And when they arrived there, the receptionist said to them, oh, are you the man who's writing the book about Abraham Lincoln? And she gave him a card, and on the card was the phone number and name of a psychic who lived in the area. Well, Don contacted the psychic, and she said, I'd love for you to come round and we'll do a seance. So they went round, and the psychic had her husband and a couple of friends there. And they all sat around the table, and Don had taken his camera and a recording device, and they started the seance. And the psychic was telling the sister and Don about things that happened in their childhood that only they really knew about. So they were pretty convinced that she was contacting something or someone. When all of a sudden, in the hallway of the open door, the figure of a woman appeared, and she appeared to be wearing a really old-fashioned dress, like a bustle. And then the psychic suddenly started making choking sounds, and a red line started appearing, and it went from one side of her neck round to the other, as though her neck was being slashed. And all hell broke loose, really. So everybody started screaming and getting up and panicking. And the sister said that Don just said, everybody hold hands and start praying. And he led them in a prayer. And she said eventually things calmed down and went back to normal. But we left pretty quickly after that. And she said I would never, ever go to a seance again. So his mother, after Don's body had been found, wanted the car that he'd driven to be returned home. So she asked one of his friends to go and retrieve the car, and when he was driving it back, he parked at a motel overnight. And when he came back in the morning, the car had been broken into, and lots of the research about Abraham Lincoln had been taken. Well, the car got back to his mother's house, and that night the car was broken into again, and more was taken. Well, whatever they had left of his research, they decided to donate. And I think it was the first one they donated it to was a really keen researcher of Abraham Lincoln. Well, he died in a fire in his house, and the notes burnt with him. Then they donated what they had left, which I believe was some audio that hadn't been in the car but had been at his house. So they donated this to a man who ran a Civil War store in Virginia. Well, he died, I believe, in an accident, and again, the audio tapes went missing. So it appeared that people were clearly dying whenever they got hold of this information. But really, there's no kind of answer as to what was going on. One other thing was that his friend who'd driven the car back, he said, when I got out of the car and looked on the ground, there were some coins on the ground, and one coin was for the year that John was born, and the other coin was for the year that Abraham Lincoln was murdered. And he said that he had a repetition of this happening a lot, so coins would turn up and they applied to Don. So there's never been a real solution about what was going on.
There's so many weird things about this story, it's ridiculous.
I know.
As I said, the fact that the guy who, the phone calls came from looked just like the guy who was missing. The lack of tracks going to the barn, the 3 socks, what the hell happened to this guy? It's hard to even say foul play because there didn't seem to really be any damage to the body. It just, was missing for a while.
I know, and why? So how was the hole in the head made?
Yeah.
Why was he put back exactly where he disappeared? Where had he been for 4 years? What did the seance and the psychic have to do with it? Why were people stealing? If anything, that's true. Yeah. Why was his material being stolen all the time?
And why? But with that also, why did they break into the car twice? Why didn't they just take it all the first time?
I don't know. And, someone recently said to me, well, why would people be interested in what happened to Abraham Lincoln so many years ago? And then I thought, well, maybe it was somebody who was part of the group that he was in, and they were jealous because he came across the information they wanted and they killed him. But it's a really long-winded way to go about doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if the Lincoln stuff had if someone was trying to keep it secret, the only thing I can even think of is that it pointed to some secret society that took Lincoln out that still exists today.
Yes. And they wanted it to look like it was, clearly he was abducted by aliens and this is what happened to him. Maybe it was all put in place to be a cover for what they had done.
Yeah, but even that feels like stretching to explain.
Well, it's very extreme, but maybe they took pleasure in having this plot. Maybe that was the fun of it. Even I don't know. It is a bit extreme.
Maybe the guy was involved in something completely else, and they did this just to kind of throw everyone off the track.
Yeah.
The hole, though, geez. I mean, that to me points to. See, I hate to jump to paranormal, but it could point to saying paranormal. But it could also point to high technology, not just in an extraterrestrial UFO type or interdimensional type of way, but also to our own government, which might have technology that could have made a hole like that we just don't know about.
Yeah.
In which case, what did he step into?
I don't know. I'd like to know. I don't know. I'm probably going to look at this one again.
Someday someone will eventually will invent a time machine, at least a time machine where we can look at the past, if not interact with it. And it'll be great to be able to go back to some of these things and be like, all right, what happened to this guy?
Okay. Yeah. So, oh, right. That's really mundane. Oh, so that's what happened. And everybody just got really carried away. Yeah. Yeah.
It would ruin some fun speculation. There's no doubt there.
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it?
And what if we still couldn't figure it out?
Yeah, what if there were even more ingredients that we didn't know?
We're watching the guy walk across the field and suddenly he's not there anymore, and that doesn't really tell us what happened to him.
No.
And the Pleiades thing is interesting because that's one of those stars that are star areas of stars that are often referred to in a lot of different stuff. I mean, it is one of the favorites for where extraterrestrials come from.
Yeah. I mean, it's painting them as bad guys in this case.
Sure.
And then someone said to me recently, but hold on, they're not always the bad guys. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know. I don't know enough about the Pleiades, really.
Well, even in mythology, the Pleiades figure in very, very strongly in a lot of mythology. So, all right, let's move on to Chapter 2, the case of Arnold Archambault?
I think so. Yes, well, in March 1993, 2 bodies were found lying in a ditch. However, if we go back to the December of 1992, this was when the bodies had disappeared, because it was a December cold, sort of early hours of the morning, and 3 teenagers were in a car, and it was on a remote intersection of the Yankton Sioux Indian Reservation, which is in South Dakota. So they were driving in the car, and it was really icy, but because the intersection was clear of cars coming, the driver just sort of crossed without stopping, and they skidded and they ended up going into a ditch. Well, the ditch was frozen over, but the car turned on its head and they were sort of trapped inside. Well, Arnold Archambault, who was 20, he was the driver, and his girlfriend Ruby, who was 19, was his girlfriend, and they also had her cousin in the car, who was Tracy. Well, Tracy later said that they had been drinking, and they tried to get out of the car, and actually she saw her cousin get out of the car, and she tried to get out behind her, but the door slammed closed. So she was trapped. She couldn't get the door to open anymore. So she was stuck there. But by the time she managed to free herself sometime later, the boyfriend and girlfriend had disappeared. So at some point, a car came along, and the police then came and they started searching for the boyfriend and girlfriend, because they were concerned that as they'd been drinking, it was so cold, they were liable to go into shock and it could kill them. So the police started searching everywhere and carried on until it got to daylight. Well, they knew that they weren't in the small ditch because that was frozen over, but they wondered if they'd somehow found themselves going to the lake, which was a bit of a distance away. So they tracked all the way to the lake, but they saw no footprints, and the lake hadn't been broken in any way. So they couldn't work out where the boyfriend and girlfriend had gone. Well, this, again, was a mystery because they searched everywhere, and it wasn't until 3 months later that a driver was just driving along and he saw a body lying by the ditch. And they were able to identify who it was from the tattoo because the body was decomposed. but it turned out to be the missing girlfriend. Well, she didn't have any shoes on, her glasses were missing, but she was wearing the same clothes, and they knew it was her from the tattoo. So they thought, well, the boyfriend must be here as well, and they looked all around, but they couldn't find him. When they went back the next day, they found the boyfriend's body. Well, the sheriff eventually got all of the searchers to sign affidavits to show that they'd thoroughly searched 3 months earlier. They couldn't have been in the ditch, they weren't in the lake, and they didn't seem to be anywhere else. So he was firmly convinced that clearly something very strange had happened, because the bodies had disappeared and then they'd come back. The weird thing was that the boyfriend had a key on his possession, but the key didn't belong to any relatives or anybody that the family knew. So they had no idea where the key came from. And also, he again, like with Don, he'd been seen actually on New Year's Day in the company of a group of young men. And again, the person who said that was polygraphed. So they were telling the truth about seeing him, but I suppose you could say, again, perhaps were they mistaken in seeing him?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no logical explanation, again, as to what could have happened in this case, because, people would say, well, clearly they were in the ditch froze over. When it thawed, then they were found, but they weren't found on the same day, and the ditch was frozen when they went missing. And the sheriff...
And wasn't one more decomposed than the other?
Sorry, yes. So the girl who was found, identified by the tattoo, was decomposed, but the boy was pristine. So he wasn't decomposed at all in any way. So again, where had he been for months? I suppose the thing I was thinking when I thought what could have happened was, well, if he had a key on him and his body wasn't decomposed, was the couple taken by somebody that drove along, abducted them, said they were rescuing them, but abducted them, held them, killed the girl somehow, although they didn't have any wounds on them, but somehow, for some reason, the girl died or was killed, and the young man was kept by this person for whatever reasons he wanted to keep him for, and then at some point decided, okay, I'm going to take them back to where I found them. We don't have to understand that. Maybe that was part of his ritual, if that's what happened. Because in a way, you have to think, surely this has to have a human hand in it.
You would think, but what?
Yeah.
It's just one of those really bizarre, what the hell's happening here type of things.
Again, because the sheriff was very adamant that the reason that he made everybody sign these statements was to say, look, we thoroughly searched here. We found nothing to lead us in the direction of where the couple had gone. There was nothing for us to go on, and we went everywhere that they could have walked to.
And why leave the third person behind?
I don't know. I don't know. Because, yeah, they didn't help her out. They just left her. Yeah.
Instead of taking her too, or whatever happened. Yeah, it's another one of those that where you're just scratching your head. It seems like we're missing information, but what?
Well, there is a chance, I suppose. There is a chance that perhaps the third person, so the cousin, the girl, perhaps she knows more than she was letting on. But you would imagine that obviously the police would have been very thorough in questioning her. I don't know if they did polygraph her, but certainly the sheriff said it was the most baffling thing he'd had in his 2-decade career. So he really wanted to get to the bottom of it. So maybe she had more to do with it, but you would have thought they would have perhaps found that out.
Yeah, grilled her a little bit better.
Yeah.
Or maybe they did. I mean, we don't know. All we can go on is the information that you can collect on it, and that's just... It's just so... Some of these are so weird.
Yeah.
That even paranormal explanations don't really, explain anything, really.
No. Why was one decomposed and one not? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe they fell into a time hole and it killed them. And then one was dropped back and then the other was dropped back. I mean...
Wow.
That's, of course, inventing a thing called a time hole.
Yeah. We don't know, do we?
But
Do not
hey,
know.
if we have a time hole, it could possibly explain it.
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk about some of chapter 3, which is dealing with Rendlesham Forest. Now, of course, I've had Peter Robbins on here talking in detail about the UFOs at in Rendlesham Forest, the big case in 1980, numerous times, um, and everyone knows about that. What's always fascinated me is that Rendlesham is also a place where a lot of other weird stuff happens. And I think that is important, taking into account the UFO sightings there. I don't think they're two different things. I think that whatever happened that night in 1980 is connected to the stuff that people experience all the time in that forest. I think that, it's not two separate things like, oh, we have this forest where weird stuff happens. Oh, and a UFO happened to land there too.
Well, that's the thing. Because I'm, relatively new to this kind of field, I had heard, obviously, of the Holt incident in Rendlesham, and Rendlesham wasn't somewhere that I was ever going to really write about because people have covered this, so certainly I wouldn't have looked back at that case.
Right.
But I must read Peter Robbins' books actually on this, because now that would be fascinating. But the reason I wrote about it was because a man called Chris Nash had contacted me on Facebook, and he started sending me photographs that he'd taken inside the forest. So I got to know Chris through what he was doing, and in fact, it's a very sad story now because Chris has actually passed, and he had a car accident when he was leaving the forest, and he wasn't that old, so it's very, very sad. But he had started sending me photographs, and he sent me one that was inside the forest, so it's the backdrop is the dark trees, and there's a pair of glowing yellow eyes, and to me it looks like there's an angular shaped face, and you can even see what look like horns. So you can say, well, that's a bit ridiculous, but actually it's a very frightening photo, and I actually didn't want it on my computer because it really freaked me out too much. And he said, I took this photo not long ago. He said, but I'm a bit worried now because he said at the same time I was walking back on the path to leave the forest, because he used to go there and stay all night, and he was going home, and as he walked along this path he heard this voice in his ear calling his name. And he said, and after that, I felt this presence bearing down on me. And he said, it felt like death itself. Well, he goes home, and he said that he started to hear growling in his house, and that he woke up one morning and he felt like something was bearing down on his chest and he couldn't breathe. And he was so concerned by it because he decided to go to a medium, and the medium said, take the photo out of my house. And she also said to him, if you continue to go back to the forest, you're playing with fire. Well, although Chris was really perturbed by what was going on, because he also sent a photo that had what looked like 6 impressions, so 6 marks on his leg, red marks as though caused by 6 fingers. And again, you can say, well, I'm sure you can just do that yourself and send a photo. But the thing is that a lot of his photos are corroborated in a way because other people that I've now sort of spoken with do go to the forest, and they have even stranger photos. So Chris took this to a medium, and she'd said, I advise you not to go back. And so really that he'd contacted me after this, and he said, what do you think I should do? And I said, well, I'm not an expert here, but I suppose if I was in your position, I'd probably go to a spiritualist church or maybe an exorcist even. And he sort of ummed and ahed that. And I think he said that he'd spoken to people, and he wasn't really sure what to do about it. And the thing with Chris is that he was also really attracted to that forest. For him, it almost felt to him like he was home when he was in the forest. So he had a love for it, being in there and being amongst all of this. But he had a couple of experiences as well that were disturbing, because he said, you know how sometimes you might fall out with someone who's been a friend to you, and inside you're thinking, oh, that person's hurt me so badly that I wish something would happen to them. He said, well, I was thinking that, I would never do anything to anyone, but I suppose I had some thoughts about someone, and he said the next thing you know, they're dead. And he had some thoughts about another person. The next thing you know, they're dead. So he was beginning to think in his mind that actually this entity that seemed to have attached itself to him was almost offering him, offering the chance to have this kind of power. Because he said, one day I was sitting, I was on the phone, so I'd pulled my car over and I was making a phone call, and I'd parked outside a place that had some really massive iron gates. And he said, I was just sitting there looking at them, and it had a big padlock on the gates. Well, I turned my gaze away from it and then turned back to it. A few seconds or moments later, the gate's wide open and the padlock's off. So he said, I feel like I'm being offered this choice between good and evil, and it's showing me that it can give me this kind of power to do things to people or objects. And he said, I would never take it, of course, but I feel that that's what's happening to me. Well, he also spoke about a lady called Brenda Butler. Now, he used to go there and meet her there, and there was quite a crowd of people that used to go there to the forest and still do, and have been going for decades. And this was all new to me. But he put me in, he managed to get hold of Brenda and say, that I was able to sort of talk about her experiences, because I wanted her permission. And she'd actually written a book about her experiences in Rendlesham, and hers started 3 decades ago. And actually, just prior to the famous Rendlesham incident, she'd been living in a farm about 20 minutes away from the forest, and it was her father's farm. And one night they saw bright lights descending, and they watched out of the window, and the next morning they could see that the ground was all chewed up from something landing and the treetops were broken. In her mind, something had happened that night. Well, incidents, as she sort of asked local people, other incidents sort of came out, because she spoke with a rabbit catcher. And again, this was before the incident in Rendlesham, and he was in the forest at night, and he saw a group of children that looked like they were in fancy dress costumes. So he went to go towards them. He saw them in the distance and he approached, but as he got closer, they disappeared. So he phoned the Air Force base and got hold of the security, and they came to the forest, but they started questioning him, and of course the children had gone, and they took him back to the base, and they actually arrested him and grilled him about what he'd seen. Another witness had been in the forest walking his dog, and he said that he saw something that looked like a craft, and he saw some unidentified entities. Well, he also said he wondered at first if he thought they were firemen, because they were in silver type outfits. But he said, I knew as well at the same time that our firemen don't wear silver outfits. So, of course, Brenda has been going in the forest for 30 years, and she's had some such strange experiences, because she said that one day she was with an American friend and they were just walking along with her dog, when the next thing they knew, they were in what looked like a completely different place, because the trees and the ground had all changed. The trees had gone away, and it was like they were in a really big open field. And they carried on walking, wondering where the heck they were, because she knew the forest like the back of her hand, and she'd never seen this part of the forest. So eventually they do manage to get out of the forest, and they go back to their car and decide to drive around to where they think they might have been walking towards. And they look in the car, and of course there's no open fields that look anything like what they'd been in. And she said that she's had experiences where she'll be walking along, and the next thing she knows, she's in a completely different part of the forest, as though she's been transported to it. But she's got no explanation for it. The other thing she said is that she knows other people that have gone to the forest, and they are absolutely certain that they've been dragged down to an underground sort of tunnel or base by the greys. And she says, well, no, I've never experienced that at all, and I don't believe that happens. However, I have had them walking alongside me, and I've seen them digging. So she's adamant that she's seen them, and they are doing some kind of work in there. So, all of this I'd never heard anything about apart from this famous incident, but it seems that the forest is alive with the things they capture on their photos as well, sort of ectoplasm and orbs all the time. So,
Yes. So
yeah.
I think that the 1980 incident has to be taken in context with the fact that all these other experiences are had. This is obviously a hotspot for weirdness.
Because
And
it
to
does seem, sorry, it does seem that some of these things were going on before this Rendlesham Forest incident. So, because when I've heard it on radio shows, and I was thinking, I wonder if it really happened, or, is that really the case? And when you find out about other experiences in there, to me, in a way, it really validates that actually this very much could have happened.
oh yeah, I have no doubt that it actually happened. My questions tend to be more the nature of what happened than whether or not it actually happened. Was it extraterrestrial, or as one of the other people lately he came out and said, time travelers, um, or is it something completely different that just appears as different things to different people? And I know Peter Robbins himself said that he sat there and watched all these UFOs appearing over the forest one of the times he went there to investigate. Just
Did
one
he?
after another, just popping up and disappearing. And, he definitely leans more toward the nuts and bolts extraterrestrial explanation. And so I said to him, well, why would it be just this area? And his thought is it was a portal of some kind that they were coming through from somewhere else, which, certainly could be the case.
Well, actually, when I was just reading up just to see if I could find out any more, for the book, somebody in February I think this was last February, had been walking his dog. So this is very current. Had been walking his dog, and he had captured on film what he said was some kind of craft, and I'm pretty sure it's on the internet. Well, I found it, I think, through a newspaper article. So he was saying, I've been in this forest for all my life. I've never had anything like this happen, and then there's this thing in the sky following me. So it does seem to be very active. Actually, one of Chris's friends sent me a message and said, you're welcome to come down with us and have a look. I'm thinking, crikey, I hope I come back if I go.
I don't know that there are lots of disappearances connected with the area though.
Right.
So, you might be all right.
Yeah, it's pretty scary though.
If I were there, I would definitely check it out. But then again,
Mm.
I'm the one who runs toward the screaming.
You are. Yeah, I run in the opposite direction, so I.
I want to know what's causing the screaming.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next one that we're going to talk about, you labeled True Detective or the movie Deliverance, and this is again a very strange story, and I can't imagine any reason that the people involved here would be making this up. The best I can think is maybe they misunderstood something that was going on, but even so, there's too many little pieces to this story to just dismiss it, I think.
It's the craziest story I've ever come across. And I get quite confused telling it, so I hope I make sense. So it began when two boys in 1984, and just to bear in mind as well, this was about a year after the West Memphis case. So in 1984, two college-age boys called David and Heath had decided they were going to go from East Pennsylvania over to Arizona, where Heath was going to take up a student teaching role in a school, but they were going to make it a road trip to get there. So they were going to go through the states and end up in Texas first, where they were going to have a few days holiday. They were then going to drive to Arizona, and David was going to fly back home, and Heath would start his teaching job. So they set off and they leave from East Pennsylvania. And when they get to Arkansas, they start believing that a convoy of vehicles are following them. And the convoy is up to 30 vehicles long and includes tractor trailers. So they say that they fled through that state, and they were actually having to crisscross and backtrack, trying to shake off this 30 vehicle long convoy. At one point, they end up in Lauderdale and Tipton counties, which is in Tennessee. But prior to this, they say that they'd actually tried to get help, and they'd stopped in a hamlet called Prescott in Arkansas, and they'd gone up to the sheriff, and they told him that these vehicles were following them. So the sheriff said to them, well, show me which vehicles you're talking about. And so they pointed to some vehicles, and the sheriff said, well, they've got local plates, and just started laughing at them. So they carried on, and in fact the sheriff later said, I have no idea what you're talking about. When the newspapers asked him, he said, I didn't even speak to any boys.
Of course.
Well, yeah, so they carry on, and they don't stop for 250 miles, and they approach the Texas border, and here they claim that they were boxed in by these tractor trailers and forced to returning back into Arkansas. Again, they stop a highway patrol officer, and they tell him that they're being stalked by these cars, and he just laughs at them. So they drive on, get to the border of Tennessee, and now at this point it's getting dark and they're close to running out of petrol. So they say at this point, two cars at the front of the convoy that look like cop cars chase them into a field, and their truck gets stuck in the mud. So they jump out of their car and they leave all their possessions and they just run for their lives, because this convoy of people have now got out of their vehicles and are chasing them. And the people include not just men, they include women, they include children. So in a blind panic, David and Heath enter the woods, which turns out to be a swamp. Heath can't swim, but David can. So David jumps into the water. He leaves Heath standing on the side, and Heath runs into the woods, and he says that he spent the whole night in the woods where he can hear bird calls. So this group of people are stalking him and chasing him, and they're communicating with each other through bird calls. And he's hiding in the trees because he's terrified they're going to get him. So he keeps moving position. He stays there all night, and when it gets light, he leaves because he can't see them, and he walks for miles, and eventually he gets to a farmhouse. He manages to raise the woman who's in there, and she feels sorry for him, gives him a shower, gives him food to eat, and she even agrees to drive him to the airport. She gives him money, or gets it transferred, I think, and when he goes to the airport, he gets on a plane and he leaves. So we've no idea what's happened to his friend. Well, later it turns out a man who is on the river at night fishing saw David clinging to a log floating down the river, and he says to him, can I help you? Are you all right? And David just says no, because he's convinced that this man is part of this cult who are trying to kill him. So the man, the next morning, he goes to a police station and he says, I've seen this boy clinging to a log. I think he might be in trouble. Well, in the meantime, the next morning, David has got out of the water and he's walked for miles and he's found a different farmhouse. Oh no, sorry, I've got it wrong. So I get confused. Sorry, he was clinging to the water, and when he got out of the water, at some point he's in the woods and he gets captured by this group of people.
Right, yes.
Yeah, sorry. So they drag him off to a tiny church, and the church is later corroborated as existing by the police. So at this church, outside of it, he says that they start sacrificing chickens and pigs, and they rub all the animal blood over him, and he believes clearly he's going to be sacrificed, because he said, I could see decapitated heads in the trees. Well, somehow or other, he manages to flee from them. So he breaks free and he runs for his life, and yes, so he goes for miles and eventually comes upon a farmhouse. He breaks into the farmhouse because nobody's home. He phones his girlfriend and he says, get the police here quick. In the meantime, he helps himself to some food and drink, and then he goes into the garage to wait for the police to arrive. Well, in
with a
the
knife.
yes, and at this point he's lost his contact lenses, and I guess they came out when he was swimming, and he doesn't have his glasses, so he can't see very well. But he's still scared that at some point these group of people are going to come upon him again. So he grabs a knife and he waits for the police to arrive. Well, the police do come, but only in one car, and the car is an unmarked car. And it turns out that actually the home he's broken into belongs to the deputy sheriff, who is not wearing a uniform. And so when he turns up, the boy thinks it's the cult come to get him again, so he walks towards him with a knife. So the police pulls the gun and arrests him, and he's taken to the police station, where he tells them, I've had a night from hell. And they just take him to hospital, get him dehydrated, and decide that he should
You mean rehydrated?
Sorry, rehydrated, and decide that he's mad and that he should be sent home. But they do actually decide to charge him at a later stage. Well, the local newspaper for where the boy lived followed this story a few months later, because he was going to be taken back to that state and charged with trying to harm the police officer and for breaking in. In the interim, the boy has been sent to a mental institute because he's become so unhinged by whatever it was that happened to him. His mum said he walks around clutching a Bible all the time in this mental asylum because he is so disturbed. He won't tell me what happened, but I know something happened to him. And she says, also he wasn't religious. He would never have picked a Bible up, but this seems to give him some kind of comfort, because the police are trying to get him extradited to take him back to be charged. When the police were interviewed, they say, well, yes, that church exists, and all right, so there may have been some kind of rumours about some kind of cult, but very tiny rumours. We've seen a bit of graffiti here and there, but no cult exists. It's just madness. Well, the two boys, of course, they never changed their story, and I suppose the thing is as well that because one of them fled and left his friend there and went home on the plane, when they first spoke out about what happened, they didn't really have time to corroborate about what happened to them that night. So, and they never changed their story. And also the families obviously were distraught about the publicity, and they said, look, he had a great career ahead of him. He was going to be a teacher. He's got nothing to gain. He's losing everything by saying that this happened. Eventually he did get charged, but I think they just charged him with a much lesser sort of sentence, and he was sent back home. But it's just so crazy.
Yeah. Like I said, there's no really good reason for them to make that up, and especially to go through it in the sense of like hanging onto the log in the river. That was verified. So clearly, what did they go through did they make it up, go through the motions, or did something happen that made them really paranoid for some reason, and were they hallucinating? And if they were hallucinating the same thing.
Exactly. And they both were supposedly drug tested and didn't have any alcohol in their system, because one of them said, well, you can put it down to us having driven too far, having got very tired, and we imagined it, we hallucinated it, but they didn't have any drugs in their system. Someone said recently, well, maybe they took a trip and it turned out to be a very bad one. Well, I don't know, because they did say that he was drug tested when they took him to hospital. So I don't know if that could leave your system really, really quickly. But if they hallucinated, yes, they both hallucinated that this terrible cult was, going to sacrifice them. So I don't know.
There was. This reminds me of something that happened to me probably a couple of years ago now, where I had turned off onto the road to go home, which is kind of a back road the way I take to get to my house. I kind of live in the middle of nowhere as it is. And someone was behind me, and I thought, well, that's weird. That never happens. Like, no one ever turns off the main road onto this road when I do. But it's bound to happen sooner or later. And I take this really weird winding path to get to my house, and this guy stayed right on top of me the entire time, to the point where it was making me a little nervous. And I thought, what is going on? Is this guy following me? Well, the only reason to turn here would be to go to my house. because it wouldn't make sense to go the way I went if I was going anywhere else. So I turn, he follows me. And then I'm thinking, there's no one at my house. I don't really want to go home. So I kept driving. And I get to the next road, and I make a left, and he makes a left, and he's right on top of me the whole time. And I start thinking, are you a cop? And if you are, why haven't you pulled me over? Because obviously, if you're following me this close, you think I did something wrong. And I get to a random road, and I turn down that road, and he slows down. He follows me, but he slows down. And then he comes flying up behind me like he's going to ram me. And I did not waver. I stayed steady at 55 because I figured if it's a cop, maybe he's looking for an excuse. And at the last minute, he hits his brakes and doesn't hit me. And I turn again, and he goes straight. And as he goes straight, I turn and look, and sure enough, it was a cop.
You're joking.
And I went down this road a little bit to someone who I knew who owned the house, and I pulled into the driveway for a minute. And I turned around, and I started coming back, and I saw him come back and then pull into the driveway at the end of the house, at the end of the road at the house. And I went, seriously? And so I went past him, and I went as quickly as I could down the road, and then I turned, and I saw him pull out like a distance behind me and start coming after me again, and I just floored it to my house because he wasn't behind me now because I had turned. And I eventually saw his lights come around the corner. I pulled into my house. I turned my lights off, and I waited. And sure enough, he flew by my house at like 90 miles an hour.
What was he doing?
I have no idea. But I was never close enough to get like a car number or anything like that. You know, there was nothing paranormal about it, obviously. It was but it was creepy because...
He sounds like a serial killing policeman.
And I've never had problems with police before, and maybe he was just bored and trying to make me do something that he could pull me over for. Who knows?
That's kind of provocative, isn't it?
Oh yeah, but it definitely, I can imagine if you have a few cars doing this, that's really going to unnerve you to no end. I mean, this was just one car late at night.
Yeah.
But you don't know who's in that car. Maybe I upset someone along the way, and him and 5 of his friends are in that car ready to beat the crap out of me.
Yeah. Or if someone's stolen a police car and they're not a policeman.
Oh, well, that's, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
That's an interesting case, too.
Yeah.
And when he was parked at the end of the other road, I almost pulled in next to him and went, what are you doing? And I'm thinking, no, that's surely asking for trouble at that point.
But that's really creepy.
So, all right. So the next one, we're going to get away from that type of creepy stuff to werewolves.
Yeah.
And the story I really liked in this book was the one with Eric Martin and his wife Shelley.
Right. Well, yes, Eric and his wife, I think it's quite a well-known encounter, but I'd never heard of it actually. But it happened in 2007 in a rural town, very small one, called Palmyra in Somerset County, Maine. And they'd actually just relocated there and bought the property, but it was a really old house. And Shelley was looking after her husband because he'd had an industrial injury, so he couldn't work. And they'd found this really picturesque farm, and they thought it would be just the kind of place to take life a lot slower and really be tranquil. Well, one evening, shortly after moving there, they were just sitting out on the porch, as they like to do every night, when they began to see lights appearing in the woods around the house. Well, Eric, at first, he thought it was probably hunters with flashlights. But then he sort of reconsidered it because the lights didn't seem to be moving as though someone was walking carrying a flashlight. So in the end, he decided to walk a bit closer to the woods to see if he could get a better look. And as he got closer to the trees, the lights went out. And then he said the silence was so unnerving because he could hear each snap of a twig underfoot. So he could certainly think someone was in there. But later he could find no tracks to show that anyone had been there. But at the time, he said he felt like a fear had come over him that he'd never experienced before. And he was an experienced hunter, but something wasn't right. Well, he shook it off and returned to the porch and just try to forget about it. About 2 nights later, they were out again, and their dogs wouldn't go outside to their pen, and they were shaking, and they were clearly really afraid. And he said the night was eerie enough as it was because a heavy fog had come down. And then they heard a strange sound in the distance, again inside the woods. But he said, I couldn't describe what the sound was, but to me it clearly implied danger. So they both went back inside the house. And from then they started hearing the sound of rustling. And they turned around just as they were going in the house to shut the door. And they said that they could see 5 sets of eyes shining out from the trees. So he thinks, well, this can't be a group of bears. And he said, I'm used to seeing animals at night time, but this was nothing like that. So they got indoors, but he wanted to go outside to get his gun so that they could protect themselves. And the thing was, they were out in his shed. So he emerges from the door, but he says that now that these creatures, they've come out of the woods, and they're there standing on their hind legs, just staring at the house. And he said the dogs had gone into a further away room in the house and were cowering, hiding. Well, he wants to try and get his car so that he can bring it closer to the house and get his wife and daughter into it so he can take them to safety. But the thing is that these creatures on their hind legs, which he say were at least 7 or 8 feet tall, have got even closer, and in his mind they could actually break the door down, the front door of the house. So as he'd moved, the motion light had come on, so these things had been illuminated, and so he could see them clearly, and they were surrounding him. Well, in his story, he says he just rushes back inside the house. He calls the police, but the police don't believe him. So they go up to the top floor of the house, and they stay there all night, and they're actually too afraid. They can't go to bed, so they stay there all morning, and the creatures have gone by the time they go out there, in the morning. But all night, he could hear scratching at the doors and the walls as though they're trying to claw their way in. And he found huge tracks outside, and he found long claw marks. And he said that the tracks clearly show that they were up on all fours, So he says, what were they? They're not bears. Were they wolves or dog men? What were they? And where did they come from? And what were the lights in the woods?
Yeah. And there's so many elements there that you could kind of cross over into other things. I mean, obviously with Bigfoot accounts, they can be that big. When you with the lights, I mean, so many weird encounters start just with lights. And I almost feel like lights are the things that then could branch off. Like maybe someone else would have seen aliens, whereas this guy saw more like dogmen. Someone else might have seen Bigfoot. So there was something there, but its form started with those lights in some way. And that sense of fear too, that dread.
Yeah, it's you're right. I remember. There's hundreds of thousands of accounts with lights, isn't there? And there was one that happened in Kent Kent in England, to a group of boys, and they said that this light descended from the sky and it stalked them through the woods. And of course, they couldn't work out what it was. And then all of a sudden, this huge black apparition turns up, and that's sort of just standing there staring at them. And then, after a few incidences of it sort of following them, the light takes off, starts to go up, and the apparition goes up almost as though it's gone up with them and disappears. But yeah, you're right. So many times it seems to be lights that herald the beginning of an incident.
Yeah. And you also got to wonder, are the lights an indication of something environmental? Are the lights somehow affecting our consciousness? Are the lights somehow doorways to someplace else that are just starting to pop through, that we're just seeing?
Very mysterious.
To say the least,
Yeah,
yes.
I know. What can you say?
Oh, okay. Let's do one more here. Maybe, let's see. I wrote down chapter 10. I don't remember what chapter 10 was.
Chapter 10. What was that?
Oh, chapter 10. Oh, the canyon mystery. This is the people going down the Colorado River.
Yeah, well, I kind of have this image of them, and actually, in fact, you can see pictures of this couple, and they do look a bit like they're Bonnie and Clyde. So it actually happened when a newlywed couple had decided that they were going to be going down the Canyon River, the Colorado River, on a raft with the intention of the lady being the first woman to complete the journey, and with also trying to break the record as to who could get down the fastest, because their plan was going to be, after that, they were going to start doing a lecture tour and get paid for public speaking. So they hoped that this adventure would be, quite fruitful for them. And so they had, the husband had built a craft, or it's called a scow, where you can tie your provisions to it. So it's almost like a small flatbed boat, and you can use that as the raft to go down. This was back in 1928. And they had prepared properly by having the right craft and getting all of their provisions that was securely sort of attached to it. And it was going to take about a month, I think, to go down. So they set off, and they did have the press following them for much of the journey because they wanted it chronicled as part of their lectures. Well, they were last seen on the November the 18th at what's called the 165 River Mile mark. There are River Mile 231 marks, so they'd got quite a portion of the journey done. And Bessie, the wife, was keeping a journal, and the last notation of her journal was actually the day before this, I think. And after this, they had somehow vanished. They had gone for they'd had a Thanksgiving dinner, so it was known that they'd stopped, they'd pulled over, and they'd made themselves a Thanksgiving dinner. And it was after this point that there's no more entries in the journal, and they've disappeared. So the supposition is then that, well, they must have fallen overboard and drowned. So the searchers are brought in, and the water is investigated, but they can't find the bodies. And of course the land is looked all over, but again they can't find the bodies. And their raft appears to be completely undisturbed because nothing has been touched or damaged. And in fact, there's a marker, which is mile 232, and this was called the Fangs because there's a set of very sharp rocks that lay in low-level water there and had snagged many rafts that go down. So the possibility was that they'd got this far, they'd hit the Fangs, and it had thrown them off the raft and they'd drowned. Now, they hadn't been wearing life preservers because they were too adventurous to do that. They didn't want them. But because the boat was completely undamaged and all of their provisions hadn't been shaken or thrown off, it was assumed that actually they probably had made it past the mile markers, and that hadn't been the one that had caused the accident. So the father of the boy had brought in really huge amount of searchers. So they'd looked everywhere, and people in the press at the time were saying, well, maybe the stress of the journey had caused them to have an argument, and one had killed the other one, and the other one had fled on foot. But the thing was, it was in winter. There was no trace that one of them had made it anywhere, and no body was found. And so again, well, if that had been the case, they would have found one, if not two bodies, because they really didn't believe that someone could have fled on foot and made it out alive of the area. There was a couple of twists that happened because quite a famous rafter years later in the 90s was called Georgie Clark, and after she died, speculation grew that she could have been the female of the couple, because Georgie was actually born as somebody called Bessie, but she'd changed her name to Georgie. However, her background was verified, and it turned out that it couldn't possibly have been her. On one occasion, a woman was with a group of people going down on a excursion, and she suddenly, in the middle of the trip, said, "I'm Bessie, and I killed my husband, and I made it out alive, and I've come back now." But again, she was ruled out, as I presume, just being a crackpot, because the date of birth and everything didn't fit in with it. And then another twist was that a skeleton was found closely to the river, and at first people thought, well, that must be the man, because it was a man's skeleton. And it was found on property that belonged to one of the photographers who had accompanied them on this river rafting trip. So they hadn't been in a boat, the photographers, but they would meet them every so often, and take photos. So this man's skeleton was found there, but actually, again, when that was investigated, he was determined to have died many, many years after the couple had disappeared. So when they disappeared, they were only 40 miles from the end of their trip. So they'd completed most of it, but they were close to the end. But again, there's no resolution as to where they went or what happened to them. And people said, well, the bodies would have surfaced at some point if they were in the water, unless they were snagged underwater. But again, that would have to mean both of them were snagged by something underwater. And so again, it's a true case, and nobody's ever been able to find out what happened to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't seem as weird as some of the other cases.
No, it's not.
But it is, in a sense. I mean, maybe they fell overboard, but that seems, it seems unlikely. It's certainly a possibility, but it seems unlikely. It's almost like they just disappeared into thin air.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose somebody could have got hold of them, buried them somewhere, but I presume they brought cadaver dogs in. They could have planned to run away, and somehow they did survive. But they were really thinking that because they were going to set a world record, they thought, well, we're going to make this a bit of a career for ourselves, and we'll get some money if we do this trip, and then we can go and tour.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird case. Like all of the ones that you collect.
I just love them when they get your brain thinking and all the different possibilities that could. And then when you find these really cryptic clues, you think, oh my goodness, what did that have to do with it?
Yeah, if anything, but you never know.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
All right. Well, this book that we've been talking about tonight is called what? Panic?
Panic in the Woods.
Okay. And it is available where?
On Amazon.
Okay. And that was nice and simple.
Well, I have made a website now. This is like really, really late to do it, but I have done it. And so stephyoungauthor.com. And actually, yeah, they're on there. I'm not very good with the technology. But they are on there.
You're getting there.
Slowly. Yeah.
And you're eventually going to be on Twitter, I hear.
Yes. It's going to be Dark Parade on Twitter.
Oh,
yes.
Excellent. All right.
Yes.
And and the new radio show Dark Parade will be starting at the end of January 2017.
Yes.
You'll be able to get it here on Where Did the Road Go. It'll be on your site, and it'll be on Deprogrammed Radio as well.
Yes.
And that I'm very much looking forward to.
Oh, me too, Soraya. Yeah. There would be lots of